Everyone, my name is Maurizio Pillitu. I'm DevOps Director at the Symphony Software Foundation. I apologize for the change of plan before. Now I'm dressing back my shirt. You've seen me on the polls before. So I think that I deserved 10 minutes of your time to talk about open source. In particular, let's start from who we are and why we like open source so much. So let's start from the technology. Symphony is a secure, decentralized, compliant messaging platform for highly regulated industries like financial services. I won't get too much into the technical details. Actually, I want to thank Dan from ChartIQ for giving such a deep introduction. And we have in the room Jade and Sachin from the Symphony team who will be happy actually to answer any of your questions. Symphony LLC was founded by the biggest financial institution worldwide to consolidate inner and inter-firm communication, but at the same time, actually to avoid vendor lock-in and be able to extend the technology at any time in a collaborative way. And this is the reason they founded the Symphony Software Foundation, a non-profit organization to actually foster an open ecosystem and open standardization around the Symphony platform, which seems similar to the discussions that the panelists were touching before. As such, the Symphony Foundation, amongst other things, hosts the open core Symphony platform and stimulates and incentivates continuous contributions from LLC to the foundation. And at the same time, hosts community-driven bots, integration, libraries, anything that is based on top of the Symphony platform that is coming from the community. As you can see, we are open source. We are born and raised in open source, and it's part of our DNA. Looking at some of the numbers that were published by Black Duck in the Future of Open Source survey in 2006, we can clearly see that open source is massively adopted, and the numbers are growing. So we have a plus 5% on consumption and a plus 2% on contribution since last year. However, when we look at the number of firms that commit dedicated resources to open source development or define formal policies for selecting and approving open source code, let me remove the chairs so you can read it, actually. The numbers are quite lower than expected, which actually points the finger pretty much at how we do open source, right? From a role perspective, we have basically two players here, consumers and contributors. And they are both in, let's say, the awareness and the maturity of these two players in open source is more of a personal journey, right? Most commonly starts with consumption, goes through contribution, commitment, and compliance. But at the same time, compliance is very important at the starting point when you consume software, because compliance gives you the tool to understand if a project does what you need, if it's reliable, if it's secure, or if you actually can use it because it's compatible with your firm bylaws in the first place. This is why compliance is so important to us and for our industry and for the foundation. So let's have a quick deep dive into compliance. We can destructure compliance in basically three items. Metrics, which is what we track. KPIs, which is actually how we give a number, how we measure our achievements, and measurements, which is basically how we produce a KPI, how we produce a number. Preferably, measurements are automated so that we can rely on a constant flow of data points, which are eventually delivered to the end user. To give you some examples, a typical metric is project activity. A typical KPI for that metrics is, I don't know, I'm just thinking the simplest one. Give me the latest date of the latest commit or the date of the latest release, right? And the measurement will be to actually access the history of commits and history of releases and take it the last entry. So metrics can, of course, change depending on industry, licenses, technologies involved. At the Symphony Software Foundation, we have set up some metrics. These are actually taken from our wiki. The link is down there, but will be later on. And we actually have divided them in 3 blocks, legal, security, and quality. With the legal metrics, we make sure that we don't have any license compliance issue. We make sure that the copyright notices are in place, that third-party dependencies are not bringing in some incompatible licenses and so on. We have different security metrics like CV impact issues or OWASP guideline implementations. And when it comes with quality, project liveliness, documentation, and test coverage as some of those that we actually are actively implementing right now. By collecting all these numbers and all these measurements, a consumer can actually access a project homepage which has more color, right? We can use badges to actually publish our metrics and our achievements. We can use graphics for trends and history of our achievements. And then we can use user guide and installation manual to simplify consumption. One of the, probably the most important, in my opinion, element of a project homepage is to provide an overall level of project quality. The Symphony Software Foundation have designed a project lifecycle that every project adheres to, which is composed of 4 phases, actually not 3. We added one last week, I think. The first phase is incubating, which is the first one that a project lands to. And it's more of the experimentation and innovation phase of a project. The active phase is for those projects that adhere to an established level of compliance. Then we have long-term maintenance, which are the projects that are maintained but have, let's say, reached a functional completeness. And then we have the archived phase, which is for park projects, those who are no longer active. Now, we have completed here our tour as open source consumers, and we have actually seen where compliance can play an important role. What does the contributor now has to do in order to enable a consumer to access this data? Real quick, this is a map of measurements that we are currently implementing and investigating in the foundation, but it's also pretty much the common measurements that you see in open source projects. We have static and runtime code analysis, third-party dependency checking for licenses, security, and outdated version, test execution, test coverage, and file classification. So not all of this can be automated. There will be still some manual activity to do, especially depending on the phase of your project. I expect that an incubating project will do a lot of manual reporting, whereas an active project is expected to have some automated system in place. But we are pretty much familiar with several tools and services that provide us with application lifecycle management tools, which also include some measurements like dashboards, analytics, or programmatic access like APIs. We are probably all familiar with GitHub, maybe Travis CI, maybe VersionI. So these are great examples to set up an ALM infrastructure, an application lifecycle management infrastructure, with some measurements and metrics without spending a lot of time and money. There is still need for time and love in general to keep this system running. One interesting note is that most of these items, if not all of them, have a free for open source projects offering, which means by the only nature that your project is open source, you will be able to access these services for free. And this is, again, in my opinion, a big advantage to use open source, even at the earliest stage of contribution. as we said, it looks very easy, but there are some challenges that need to be figured out so that this system is actually up and running and is reliable. These are some of the challenges that we have faced the Symphony Software Foundation. Complexity, of course, scales depending on the amount of projects, contributors, custom metrics, or specific secrets management requirement, as it happens for the REST API for Symphony, and how many platforms and ecosystems you support. Which brings me to my last slide. Okay, last slide. And actually, the takeaway for this very quick presentation. I think we believe, at the Symphony Software Foundation, we believe that open source is a great opportunity for consumers to have a low-risk, high-value approach to technologies, for contributors to actually meet that level of requirements from the consumer and share best practices, infrastructure, and KPI automations and metrics. The Symphony Software Foundation is actually aiming at helping both, starting from consumption and ending with proper contribution lifecycle. We are actually willing to follow you in your open source journey. Thank you very much for your attention. You can see the slides. The slides will be public on the blog, and you can follow us on Twitter.